Art and Hue. This is going to be a deep dive into art theory for games. A little bit about me. My name is Nate Abell. I am currently a concept artist at Funcom, which is in Durham. I make art to tell stories and to explore things that have not been seen before. My favorite concepts are concepts that are shocking and weird. That's where I'm having fun. Here's a couple of my pieces. This is a microjet fighter for Just Cause 4, which recently came out. That was a lot of fun to design. And then a personal piece, a photo bash piece, Love Letter to Wisconsin, where I grew up. I got my undergrad in Wisconsin. It was from a state school. It was kind of worthless. I moved to Austin, Texas, and went to grad school and learned how to do art there. Since Austin, I've been freelancing for 6 years, living all over the United States, and now I'm here at Funcom, which I've been here for 6 months. If you'd like to check out my work or get in touch, that's my email address or my website. There'll be more information about that at the end. So we're going to start with this image. Right now your brain is looking at that and you're trying to figure out what's going on. It's blurry, you can't see what it is. Your brain is trying to process through that. That took like a half of a second for you to come to whatever conclusion you're going to come to about that. That journey, that half a second journey, is what we're going to talk about today. How people see things out of the corner of their eye, and what makes them decide, I'm going to look at that and care, or I'm not. You want your art, you want your game to be something that draws people's eyes over, that people care about, and then they will invest in it, and they will continue to buy your expansion packs or whatever. They will continue to view your art. They will click on your marketing ads. So who wants to say what these are? Does anyone want to take a stab?
They're weapons.
Weapons? Weapons? Okay, check it out. Tiger and a donut. Y'all think I'm concept art. That's an interesting jump, right? He's gonna do guns. No, I like to use a tiger and a donut because it's a wonderful representation of like a good thing and a bad thing. When you see something out of the corner of your eye and you're like, that might be a tiger, your brain is going to kick in and you're going to go, I got to look at that and get more information about that and either run away or, is it in a cage? I need more information. A donut is the opposite, right? It's like, ooh, there's a donut there. What kind of donut is it? Is it free? Is it on the ground and dirty? You've already hooked the viewer at that point because they've already looked at the donut. Now I want more information about that donut to figure out whether it's good, whether it's bad. How good is the situation that I've just found myself in? So the goal for this demonstration is to go through art fundamentals and through the lens of games and just try to understand how we're putting together our images, how we can better put together illustrations, marketing, art, icons, your UI, to get people to care. And once you've got people caring, then just weave a story for them. Hopefully we can all leave here at better visual designers. Two big things we're going to be talking about are contrast and story. I'm going to cover contrast in the next frame. The story is far more complex than I could ever present here. We're talking about that first half a second of interaction. Story is how you take that first half second and stretch it out to Halo 6. That's a journey that is beautiful. If you get in touch with me via email, I can send you some of my book suggestions. There's Hero of 1,000 Faces is a wonderful book that talks about how to make that first half second into a trilogy or whatever, make lots of money. So we're going to talk about contrast. The definition of my version of contrast is to differ strikingly. So you have spectrums in everything that you look at. The light from the top of this wall to the bottom is going to get cooler. It's going to become less textured, more textured. That makes that wall interesting. This is not an interesting wall because it's flat. It's not supposed to be. But in a game, you always want to be having that sort of movement. This lovely lady's hair in the front row here, she's got dark on top and lighter on the bottom and green in the middle. That is more interesting than if it was just one of those colors. Because there's more things to look at. You're traveling through that. When you create your illustrations, when you create your games, be thinking about the maximum extent of your contrast that you can accomplish. So for example, a lot of paintings will not use every single color on the palette. Your painting looks wacko, and it's really hard to look at. If you're going for that, good job, but most people aren't. If you're doing a representative painting, you're going to want to narrow the spectrum to something that is easy for the eye to look at, easy to take in. You might have one little spot of pure white and one little spot of pure black, but most of that painting is going to be safe. It's going to be not grabbing your attention. It's not going to be strikingly different. The best part about this is in game dev, when your creative director says, hey, we have a new enemy that we just made up last night. We need it to be different than anything else in the game. You say, cool, we have the ends of the spectrum that we've conserved. So we're using only reds for our good guys and only blues for our bad guys. Let's make this enemy yellow. And your players will automatically know that this is not something I've run into before. And that is really great. Another thing that's wonderful about contrast is if I go down the left side of this, yes, the left side. If I asked the average here, what's the opposite of red? Green, right? Blue. Depending on what you're talking about, we'd end up in an area that's pretty much the same set of colors, the opposite of red. That's a consensus. That's a societal consensus that we can rely on to talk about stuff in our games. What's the opposite of lawful? Chaotic. What's the opposite of happy? You can take those expectations that people bring to your game, alter them slightly, and then people will understand that your game is over here. It's its own world, and we are going to live in that world. And every time I run into something that is not red but yellow, I know that this is what's going to happen. So you've trained your player to understand that in your world, the opposite of red is yellow. So then when you make something green, what does that even mean? You've conserved that for something really wonderful. Feel free to stop me at any point if this is confusing. This is art theory, real deep stuff. So a lot of people get this in their first year of school, and then they don't talk about it again, and they're pushed out into the industry. And it's like, this stuff is so important to understand, because it's like, when you sit down at your easel, or you sit down in front of your Cintiq, why are you making that image? That's what this is going to tell you, how to make that image the most striking you can. This is actually a pyramid by Stephen Luther Richards. I've asked for permission. I think it might be Richard. At Luther.com, in the bottom right-hand corner there, awesome breakdown of how that first half second of figuring something out, your brain goes from the bottom of that to the top of that pyramid like that. So we're going to break down those individual steps in images so that you can apply that to screenshots in your game, you can apply that to your UI, to your marketing, and to your illustration portfolio. My definition of design is a thoughtful composition of elements. Abstract art talks about entities more than it talks about a square or a red thing. So the fact that you have an element and another element is more important than whether they're squares or circles at an abstract level. It's kind of difficult to think about something without being anything, but got to sound like I know what I'm talking about. We're going to be talking about Gestalt principle a lot, which is it's a bunch of German psychologists in the 30s that came up with this way of people perceiving. I'm tapping into a lot of that theory to talk about this stuff. It influenced the Bauhaus Design School, which is like the tables and chairs that you're sitting in, and these lights were all influenced by Bauhaus Design School and the simplicity and how they approach design. They just had their 100th year anniversary, so I was super excited about that. Gestalt principle states that we perceive the whole, not the parts of the whole. When you look at a tiger, you are not looking at each individual toenail, you're not looking at each individual hair. Your brain automatically goes, all those things together equals a tiger. That's different to me than if it was just a toenail. So you're not thinking about those individual things. Your brain is just shorthanding all that and saying, that's a tiger. What do we do because of that being a tiger? And that's really what Gestalt principle talks about. Tension is a little bit going into the story end of what I'm going to be talking about, which is when that half second to half second taking in of that visual information, you will have, those will be different. They will have contrast between them. A happy moment in a video game, a sad moment in a video game, a part of your illustration that's easy to look at and chill, a part of your illustration that is not easy to look at and is not chill, and why those things are the way they are. Tension is what begins to build story. So we're not going to talk too much about tension, but just varying the ways in which you are composing your images or your games, shots, or whatever you're trying to accomplish is how you get to story. So we start with abstraction, the bottom of this pyramid. Move to dynamic, which is basically shapes, values, edge pull, and sharpness. That's when the idea of something becomes an actual square. So that's a nice jump. It's nice to have like actual applicable things. We recognize color, lighting, and I'm not really even going to bother talking about semantics, symbolism, or details. Why you make art is up to you. Who you're making art for is really important. That is less important to how quickly people interact or understand your art than the abstract dynamic colors and lighting. So you want to make a story about freedom, or you want to make a story about tragedy, that is less important than the abstract message that you're sending with your imagery. We're going to go up that pyramid that way. So the very first thing with abstract art is the canvas. This is a blank image, obviously. And we're going to be, I'm going to be talking about how we fill this and what we think about. But I just wanted to have this here because it's such an important step that I feel like a lot of us blow through. I blow through it all the time. Of like, this is a question of like, what's my medium? What's the budget? Who's my audience? What am I trying to say? Who's going to be at the conference that I'm going to be giving this presentation to? What's the light going to be like on the screen in this room? All those things make you look smart later on and fill in and make for better art and a better vehicle for whatever you're trying to say later. And I feel like that kind of captures that. But ultimately, this is just the fact that there is a world space that we are going to be filling with our things. We have to assume that. For example, we talked about what's the opposite of red. There was a consensus. Not everybody's going to answer the same, but there'll be a general direction of like blues, greens, depending on if you're a digital or a traditional color palette. That is this. That is relying on this. People are going to be bringing those assumptions to your game, to your illustration. Now we have something. Don't think of that as a square. Think of that as an abstract positive. We have a figure and a ground. This is a big deal, right? This is a lot of films are this. Castaway, right? Is this? It's a figure and a ground, and that's it. It's a beautiful story with tons of meaning, but ultimately, that's what it was. I guess you could say that volleyball was maybe another ground. The relationship between that figure and that ground become important. The silhouette of it, where it's moving, how it's doing stuff, that's all later, but the fact that we have something positive and something negative is really important. Now we're getting somewhere. We have two things. Now there's a relationship between those things in the environment. Now we're moving them around. We're starting to move into dynamics already. What's the story that's happening between these squares? I'm asking you to care about this, so you are, but if this was just on a sign in a subway station, or you wouldn't care. This is not an interesting story. You're not taken yet, but it's beginning to be more interesting than a white square. Now we're breaking the edges of the canvas. We're moving into something that's a little bit more complicated. There's a relationship. There's maybe depth being suggested. Our eyes moving around a little bit more. We're breaking those edges more. We're still in dynamics. We're out of abstract, but we're in dynamics. We haven't even gotten to that top tier, and already this is like a basic thumbnail for an illustration potentially. We added a little bit of lighting now. We skip color. We're beginning to understand that there's cast shadows underneath whatever's over here maybe. And there's maybe light hitting, maybe that's a figure on the right. You're beginning to understand what's going on. I'm slowly giving you more and more information so that you can you're not looking at that going, I don't know. You're looking at it going, cool, there's a story there. And this is literally just a little bit more information than that. We're varying our edges a little bit. We are pushing and pulling light a little bit more. We're suggesting more things. But all in all, that's not very much different than this from like a abstract element. And then that's the final image. This is actually one of my pieces for my company, StoryForge. Would you rather look at that or this? It's the same thing, just with a little bit of icing on it. All right, so let's go through the tools that I use to make an image like that and how Gestalt talks about how to go about these things. Has anybody heard of this or understand it? You could just raise your hand if this is making sense. Yay! So the G on the left, if I covered up any one of those individual elements, it wouldn't be a G anymore. Your brain is filling that in. It's creating a G out of the fact that you understand English enough to be able to reference that. There's a lot of work going on in your brain right now. That's amazing that you can do that. Proximity. If I took all those squares and I spread them out across this room on the floor, you would know it was in E. Because I put them next to each other, you recognize that it's in E. You can use these in your compositions, in your illustrations, to play with meaning and drive the eye around and capture people's imaginations. Continuation. There is no white line going behind that S, going through that S. It does not move in 3D space. It is a 2D representation. Your brain is going, there's a tiger walking behind a tree. It's right in the middle of the tiger. That's not two tigers. That's one tiger, right? Because it's the front half of one and the back half of the other. Your brain is doing that work even though your eye is going, I don't know, there might be two. Similarity, and I have a better frame for this in a bit, but those T's are distinct. They don't share any pixels. They might even be a value shade off of each other. They're not associated, but our brain puts them together because they are the same shapes. Isn't it amazing that your brain is doing all this work for you and you're reading a word and you're moving on? Figure ground is something, it's used a lot in optical illusions, and I don't use it a whole lot in illustration, but it's that flip of like, is it an old woman's face or the young woman's face or the vase with the two faces on it, that kind of stuff, or is it positive and negative space or playing back and forth? If you can put that into illustration or into your marketing, people will look at it longer. There's this idea of grouping or a good gestalt, which if I asked you to describe this series of squares, you would say it's a circle of squares. Circle is now above square. You're not going to say it's however many 12 squares. You're going to say it's a circle of squares. We'll just automatically do that. It's an efficiency thing. If you're looking at everything in the room thinking that it's going to either be a tiger or a donut, you'd die. You'd never leave a room. You'd be freaked out the entire time. So this is really important to be able to understand and use in your brain, and we can take advantage of that as artists. Similarity is, those are all dots. The black ones we're grouping them together, and especially the fact that they're oriented in such a way, we're seeing two sets. This is your items in your inventory. All of the items that are a certain shape are associated. They're all your med packs or your health packs or your producing things. In an illustration, if I want to show an army of like ragtag soldiers, how do I keep those soldiers just similar enough that you understand that they are on the same team? By keeping their silhouettes the same, by keeping their color the same. I've got lots of tools to do it, but that's what I need to do to make sure that those things are wholesome. Isomorphic correspondence is an idea that our past experiences inform our future ones. Now this works from reality, and it also works from within a game. The first time you walk up to an enemy in a game that's like this soft, round, happy shape, and you go, I'm going to assume, based on my previous experiences, that is going to be a friendly enemy because it is soft, and then it pokes you, takes damage, you take damage from it. You go, oh, okay, soft things, circle things, that shape is now bad in this game. And once you get through that threshold, as long as that's always the case for that shape of enemy, people will not flip the table and say this game is dumb. So it's a really good thing to be able to do. I saw a question.
Is this like the same as the Kiki Booba theory?
Kiki Booba theory, I'm not familiar with that.
It's more because, I guess it's like, which shapes are usually seen as awesome, which is the teacher's friendly.
I'm sorry, there's people talking right through this door. Could you speak up a little bit?
Is this similar to the Kiki Booba theory?
Yeah, I'm could you explain what that is again?
I mean, Kiki implies that it's the shape that are sharp and highly angular, and Boobas implies to be the one that are the soft and rounded ones, and those would be seen with isomorphic correspondence. Yeah, 100%. It sounds like that's very similar. I've never heard it called that. I like that name better than isomorphic correspondence. But yeah, sharp things, pointed things, they will cut you. They're dangerous. Soft things are nice. This works with gravity. If I took those two shapes and I turned on gravity in like Unreal, which one of them would tip over, it's stressing you out on some level that is going to tip over. There's potential energy there visually that could crash onto a floor. The other one, it's just going to go, it's safe, it's chill. So being able to use that to talk about your art, again, super useful. Invariance is crazy.
you're grouping the things in A together, you're recognizing that those are the same shape even though they're moving in three-dimensional space. If you actually look at them, the silhouettes are completely different. How they're oriented is completely different. We see a three-dimensional object there when there is not one. It's relying on perspective, it's relying on our ideas of how to understand volume, and it's very durable. If you switch up the pieces, and in B, all of those pieces are just cut from different sections, but we still group them together. That's that group of ragtag soldiers, where one helmet is another guy's pauldron, and his knee pad, but it's the same shape. And that's how you get them to feel the same, even though they're a ragtag group of crazy, marauders or whatever. It'll work through distortion, it'll work through different styles, which is what C and D are talking about. Who's this guy? Super Meat Boy. You immediately recognize that. You weren't like, oh, it's a black line with some red pixels and like a little band-aid. You were like, Super Meat Boy. Boom, done. Let's move to the next slide. Super Meat Boy is we're gonna be taking all this art theory. You've hung in there. We're doing good. Let's take it into games a little bit. So this is our intro. This is the first way that you see Super Meat Boy. And then the next thing that you see is this. Now, if I just showed you this and said, care about that little red square in the corner, this little guy right here, you wouldn't care as much. But because you see this first, you're like, oh, that's that little red square. He's cool, I like him. He's a trooper. And now you're here. And so that's that, teaching your player how to play your game and teaching your player about your world. When you couldn't make the game out of this, right? Maybe you could have, but they made a game like this. And this game was successful because it was not trying to fight the battle of making that character run through levels with giant chainsaw blades. They're like, let's make it 5 pixels by 3 pixels. It's going to be easier on our engine, it's going to be easier. They were at that canvas stage of their game development, and they went, what battles are we going to fight, and which ones don't we want to? So let's go through, just shout it out. Does anybody see any evidence of similarity here? Things looking the same, so you group them together visually. Just shout them out. Yep, you got it.
Jump off.
Proximity.
All the walls are desaturated.
This one's a little tricky because I describe it as the floor plates being close enough together that they're a floor. If there was space between them, which you could easily have shortened the edges of them, you might feel like you fall through, but because they're close together, they're there, you get it. And the fact that they're oriented in such a way as to be angular explains what they're doing, which kind of goes into continuation. Does anybody see any evidence of continuation in here?
Throughout the whole board, especially the textures.
I think less so the texture. There's some texture work like right on the bottom there where there's that little rock, but I would use the engine drivers that are driving the spinning blades. See how they're going behind and into the wall, and then they're popping out positively? Do people track what I'm saying? These guys right here. See how this disappears? And then it comes out here and it comes back here? We're getting the idea that this is a designed space by our enemy. Dr. Beatty, I think is the name of that guy?
Dr. Fetus.
Dr. Fetus, okay, thank you. And Dr. Fetus, this is malicious. It's an evil space because it's been designed. And those tie together and break up that very tiling pattern in a really wonderful way. That's kind of off point. But yeah, and then closure. Does anybody see any evidence of closure here to drive perception, to drive logic?
There's a hole in the wall on the right side, so you think you want to go to that.
Boom, nice, you get a gold star. So the first person that ever did a side scroller said, how do we let people know that they can go to the right? The screen will pan. Let's put a hole in that wall and leave it to the edge of the screen. It goes off the canvas into the universe. Now we take that all for granted. We've been pre-programmed to understand that that's just how it is. So to be able to take that, look at it, and understand is easy. The first people that play these games, we take all the hard work and all the confusion that they had for granted. In isomorphic correspondence, it's pointy blades that will hurt you, and then walls that do not. Pretty straightforward. So we've talked about abstract theory. We've gotten into dynamics a little bit. I've talked about the tools of abstract thinking and visual designing. Let's get into dynamics. This gets a lot more concrete. We're going to be using shapes, which there are 3, edges, which are the relationships between elements and its surroundings and how we separate things from one another. Values, which are pretty much the meat and potatoes of how you compose imagery. Perspective, which is fooling the eye to think that it's in a space that's three-dimensional with flat imagery. Where the abstract sets the foundation of like what is happening and how am I, what is my default reaction to this. Dynamics begins to say, hey, we all kind of have these common experiences of like perceiving light, having gravity act on our bodies, poking ourselves on sharp objects. That's when dynamics begins to come in and help us a lot. Here are your three shapes. You've got a triangle, you've got a circle, which is basically just a triangle with lots of sides, and a square. Anything smaller than that, a line is still thick. There's a thickness to it, so you can perceive it. So it's basically just a square. And anything more complicated than a circle, you know, it's a polygon. Which of these is the most stressful square to you?
One line.
Why is that?
Because that goes under control over.
Boom. Which one is the happiest square? Yeah, it's lazy, it's chilling out. The fact that we can look at those squares, just these squares, and come to those conclusions is miraculous to me. The fact that we're empathizing with black pixels projected onto a screen right now. I feel like what I do as a concept artist is mind control most of the time, where I can put together a bunch of pixels and make people feel emotions from like anywhere in the world. I think that's absolutely amazing. Suddenly these are all way more stressful. It's like somebody shook it, right? Here's some examples of edges. The edges of one shape leading into another. One thing I like to say here is if you're an artist, you don't have to paint hard edges on things that are actually hard. Make the image work for you. Don't worry about what is actually being painted. A two-dimensional representation of something is your goal, not to communicate what something actually is. It's tricksy. Richard Schmidt, this is a painter. He is alive still. He's amazing. He's one of those guys that popped onto the scene and has been amazing, like out of the womb, you know, kind of a thing. He is a master edge worker. You can look at this and dive into it, and you can see that he's driving your eye to that house with hard edges. If you look at the bottom of this piece, or even in the sky, there are no hard edges, it's just mush. The contrast of how sharp those are and how loose everything else is, it pleases the human mind. You look at that and it's like, it just feels good to look at that because it captures a wide array of contrast. If all those edges were hard, it would be less interesting, potentially, than if he had painted it like this. This is another drawing book that I suggest people get if you are doing art. It's called Force, and it's by Mike Matesi. I'm a shape composer. I'm not a line composer. My line work is garbage. But I wanted to, pay some creed to this. You're still establishing shapes. You're still establishing positive and negative, and you're still using softer and harder edges to create reality. You're talking about the subsurface of all these things, rib cages, muscles, all this stuff, and you're doing it with line work, which to me is miraculous. We're to values now. As an artist, I break down all values to 10. There are 10 values. Any more than that, you can perceive millions of values. You can't always perceive them all at once. Your eye will adjust to dark or light, depending on if you're staring into a light and you can only see light things, you can't see dark things. And if you're staring into a shadow, your eye adjusts to that. But for a painting, you're going to only have 10 values. And this is perspective. This is about as mathy as art gets for me, but it's miraculous. We've covered dynamics now. I'm going to go into color. So I was terrible at color for a really long time, and it was because nobody bothered to point out that there's such a thing as a digital color palette. Monitors are people familiar with this? Yeah, okay. I didn't get that information until like 4 years ago. And it was like, people were like, yeah, your color's not so strong. And I was like, I just can't understand it. I saw this image and it was like, all my color was perfect. I literally could take old paintings and take what I was using orange for the opposite of blue and go whoop, over to yellow. And the painting looked great. And I was like, oh, So I'm sharing this. I'm going to get a tattoo of it on my back there. This is a really important thing to know. Values are more important to your visual intake of information than color. I called value the meat and potatoes. Color is the seasoning that goes into that. It is vital to capturing reality, but it is not what is going to win the war for you. Something that I like to point out here, I hope that the projector captures it. So which square on red is the most saturated?
7.
7, yeah. Which square on yellow is the most saturated?
3.
Colors like certain values and don't like others. Something to take into your illustrations. One reason why you see every special magic effect in digital painting is cyan, because it's emitting light and then it's falling off into a cyan. It's really easy to put that on the edges of it and pull that off. You can take that into your career and say, I'm going to only use blues or reds or whatever, and your stuff will look different. This is the Super Meat Boy screen, reduced to just chroma. I don't even know if y'all can see it. That's how important it is. This is not pretty. It is not. You're not going to play a game like this. It looks wrong. That's how important chroma is. Now, what are the things that stick out the most on the screen right now? We got Spike Pit. I heard Super Meat Boy. Anything else? Timer, right? And I like that this game, the more you die, the more red gets deposited on the level, so the more you know that you're dying. This is the values of that same shot. What sticks out the most?
Geometry. Everything that is physical.
Bingo. The most contrasty elements here are the timer again and our goal. That's where the most contrast is. So what is the designer telling us, the visual designer of this telling us is the most important thing? Where did chroma and value align? The timer. Because you're never looking at the timer, you're looking at Super Meat Boy, which the time is very important to Super Meat Boy for speed runs. So you need to be able to see it out of the corner of your eye. So let's have our chroma and our value be there. We'll leave chroma for Super Meat Boy, and we'll have value for the goal. It's super smart. That's them together. I'm going to talk a little bit about color temperature. This is one of the things that I see that's wrong in games a lot. All light has a temperature. It can be very neutral, but even neutral light has a temperature. The human eye calculates whatever that is and adds the opposite temperature, which when I say temperature, do people know what I'm talking about? Reds are warm, yellows are warm, there can be warm greens, I've even seen warm blues, and there are cool colors, which are purples, purples, blues, greens, and some really, really like magenta-y reds. So your eye is always doing that because it helps you to see tigers and donuts. And so when you have an illustration, when you have game art, you want to have your opposite, the value blocks of cool, of light and dark be opposite temperatures. So in the portrait on the left, it's a cool light, and the shadows are warm. And that's Rich. I think these are both Schmid, and that's him on the far side there. That's a warm light with cool shadows. Here's an example of a AAA, huge, crazy game, and then GTA 5. No. Plants vs. Zombies and GTA 5. Both of these are using warm lights, cool shadows. When you make that not easy for the eye to do, when you make both of them hot or both of them cool, your brain will work to make whatever one it thinks it needs to make the right temperature. If you make that easy, it's easier to look at your piece. It looks more professional, right off the bat. So we've talked about colors. Lighting is a tricky one because lighting affects the abstract pattern. The abstract idea of these is there's just a thing in an empty space, we're moving the light around it. But these are wildly different two-dimensional images that we're looking at. So a lot of times your lighting will come, you will be thinking about lighting while you're composing your dynamic and your abstract patterns. The reason that it's that spot in the pyramid is that your brain does not recognize a light source in your illustrations or in your games first. It realizes the value patterns, the abstract patterns first, then goes, oh, that's because there's a light source streaming through the piece from the right, or whatever ends up happening. It's less important to your brain than the abstract value patterns that are being established by the light. Here are 9 illustrations by Wutha. Same subject, completely different value patterns, completely different colors, completely different meaning. This is a really good exercise for environment concept art if you ever need to have a thing to do. These last 3 are whatever you need to do. You could write an entire book about semantic symbolism details about each one of those things. That's not the battle that I'm going to fight today. This is an example of what Super Meat Boy would look like with semantics. What was it? I don't even remember. Semantic symbolism and details on it. Hyper rendered, hyper fidelity, everything. We've got lightning, and he's talking about surfacing, and Super Meat Boy is actually made out of meat. The game wouldn't have been better if they had gone to the 9s with the characters. You know what I mean? So this is a fun illustration, but it wouldn't have worked for the game. Sometimes you don't need those top 3 of the pyramid to accomplish what you're doing. This is another one of my illustrations. We're just going to break it down to like outro here. So we're taking the color away, taking some of the background edges away. We're taking more information away, the values. That's pretty much what the image was. There's our abstract ideas of like a thing carrying a gun with a guy on his back. And it's a figure on a ground. That's what it broke down to. Thank you for being here. Feel free to contact me at any of those. If anybody has any questions, let me know. And I will be at Funcom's booth the rest of today. If you'd like to bring a portfolio or whatever, or chat more about this or ask questions, feel free to. Thank you so much, ECGC.